There is a jar sitting in the back of your grandmother's medicine cabinet that has never once been empty. You have always known it was there, squat and white, with a flat gold lid and a faint smell that lives somewhere between talc and cold morning air. It is Pond's cold cream, and in 1952 there was not a medicine cabinet in suburban America that did not hold one. The average American woman in the post-war decade did not simply own cold cream. She depended on it the way she depended on her percolator and her ironing board, as a fundamental instrument of daily civilized life. What most people have entirely forgotten about the 1950s is that the modern cleansing routine, the double cleanse, the micellar water, the toner and serum cascade that fills today's bathroom shelves, none of that existed yet. The medicine cabinet of 1952 was not stocked with a rotating arsenal of active ingredients. It was anchored instead by one foundational substance. Cold cream was the beginning and the end of the cleansing ritual. It removed the theatrical geometry of a day's worth of Max Factor pancake and lipstick, yes, but it also served simultaneously as a moisturizer, a protective barrier against the raw air of winter, and an overnight restorative treatment. One product did the work of 6. That this was considered remarkable efficiency rather than deprivation tells you everything about the era. Pond's had been producing its cold cream since 1846, but the post-war decade transformed it from a reliable drugstore staple into something approaching a cultural institution. The advertisements that ran in Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping between 1948 and 1955 were not selling a product so much as they were selling a philosophy. The Pond's girl, luminous, clear-skinned, often wearing a simple strand of pearls, was presented not as a model but as a neighbour. She was someone who had simply discovered the correct way to treat her face each evening, and who was generous enough to share the method. 2-step cleansing. First application, tissue removal. Second application, rinse with tepid water. The ritual was as fixed as a catechism. What the advertisements did not discuss, because they did not need to, was the chemistry of the product itself. Cold cream in its classic formulation was an emulsion of mineral oil and water, stabilized with beeswax and borax. The mineral oil dissolved lipid-soluble cosmetic residue. The grease paint, the mascara, the foundation that had been pressed firmly into the skin since morning. The water fraction carried away water-soluble impurities. The beeswax created a temporary occlusive film on the skin surface that locked in whatever moisture the application had delivered. It was, by any reasonable assessment, an ingenious formulation, and the women who used it every evening without exception had skin that bore out its effectiveness with particular eloquence. Their daughters would spend a great deal of money in the 1990s trying to approximate the same result through far more complicated means. But Pond's was not alone on the shelf. Directly beside it, or tucked behind it, depending on the geometry of the cabinet, sat a second jar of almost identical dimensions. This one was Noxzema, identifiable by its cobalt blue vessel and the sharp medicinal camphor scent that hit you the moment the lid came off. Noxzema had been positioning itself since the 1940s as the therapeutic alternative, the cold cream that did not merely cleanse but actively treated. It contained camphor, menthol, eucalyptus and clove oil, a bracing, almost aggressive botanical roster that made your skin tingle in a way that felt undeniably purposeful. If Pond's was the silk-gloved option, Noxzema was its working-class counterpart, more pungent, more self-serious, beloved particularly by women who associated discomfort with efficacy. The medicine cabinet of the 1950s was, in this way, a space of profound pragmatism disguised as ritual. Every product on its shelves served multiple documented purposes. Nothing was purely decorative. The cold cream that sat at the centre of the lineup was not merely a cosmetic but an anchor. The first thing reached for at night, and the last thing thought about before sleep. Women who grew up in this era will tell you with remarkable consistency that the smell of Pond's cold cream, encountered unexpectedly in a department store sample decades later, produces an almost violent nostalgic response. The olfactory memory of a mother's vanity table, the specific sound of a jar lid being set down on a porcelain sink edge, the thin white residue on fingertips before the tissue folded and disappeared. What has changed most profoundly is not the chemistry. Mineral oil and beeswax remain extraordinarily effective emollients, but the philosophical framework surrounding cleansing itself. The woman of 1952 understood skincare as maintenance. You cleaned the skin thoroughly, you protected it, you did not attempt to dramatically alter it. The concept of a 37-step evening routine would have struck her not as luxurious, but as slightly unhinged. Her medicine cabinet was organized around sufficiency rather than optimization, and that sufficiency was anchored by a jar that cost less than a movie ticket and lasted 3 months with daily use. Today's dermatologists, pressed on the question, will acknowledge with some reluctance that cold cream cleansing is genuinely effective, that mineral oil is a superior makeup remover, that the occlusive properties of beeswax provide measurable moisturizing benefit, and that the skin of women who used nothing but Pond's and a good soap for 40 years often looks rather extraordinary. The 1950s medicine cabinet knew something that the modern beauty industry has a vested commercial interest in making you forget, that a small, inexpensive jar of cold cream, used twice daily with discipline and consistency, does most of what needs doing. The rest, as they say, is marketing. The vanishing cream occupied a shelf position directly beside the cold cream, with a logic so obvious that the two products never needed to explain their proximity. Vanishing cream, a term that delighted women of the 1940s and 50s, and which referred not to any supernatural disappearing act, but to the cream's behaviour on the skin, where it absorbed without visible residue, was the daytime companion to cold cream's nighttime dominance. Where cold cream was rich and emollient and deliberately residual, vanishing cream was light and matte finishing, designed to be worn under powder as a moisturizing primer in the language that would later develop, though no one called it that in 1952. Pond's produced both, and the two jars, matching in size but distinct in formulation, represented a complete daily skincare philosophy in a total of perhaps 40 cents worth of product. Woodbury cold cream occupied a position slightly below Pond's in the prestige hierarchy of the cold cream market, but its advertising was in certain respects more ambitious. The Woodbury facial soap campaign of the 1920s, "The Skin You Love to Touch," one of the first American advertisements to deploy sexual suggestion in explicit cosmetic marketing, had established the brand as willing to engage more directly with desire than its competitors, and this quality persisted into the Woodbury cold cream advertising of the 1950s. The women in Woodbury advertisements were slightly less pearl-stringed than the Pond's women, slightly more aware of being looked at, and the cream was positioned as something that maintained not merely cleanliness, but attractiveness, a distinction that seems subtle, but was commercially significant in a decade working hard to separate the cosmetic from the merely hygienic. The skin tonic that followed the cold cream in the evening routine, Pond's produced this as well, as did Tangy and various department store brands, was an intermediate product that occupied a peculiar cosmetic category, not a cleanser and not a moisturizer, the tonic or freshener or astringent, the names multiplied with the manufacturers, was an alcohol-containing liquid applied on a cotton pad after the cold cream had been tissued away, designed to remove the final traces of cream residue, tighten the pores by irritating them into brief contraction, and leave the skin feeling smooth and cool and prepared for the night cream or the day cream that followed. Whether the toning step actually accomplished anything measurable was a question that 1950s dermatology was not organized to answer with clinical precision. The skin afterward felt different. The feeling was considered evidence of the process working. In this, toning was precisely like many other items on the 1950s medicine cabinet shelf. The sensory experience of use was itself a substantial part of the product's value. The night cream, as distinct from the cold cream, was a somewhat later development in the medicine cabinet's skincare hierarchy. Elizabeth Arden's 8-hour cream, introduced in the 1930s and a permanent fixture in the medicine cabinets of women who could afford it through the 1950s, was the prestige benchmark for the overnight treatment category. It was a petroleum-based occlusive ointment of unusual versatility. It softened cuticles, soothed minor burns, treated chapped lips, and when applied lightly over the foundation cream before sleep, left the skin in the morning with a smoothed, hydrated quality that daily use sustained with remarkable consistency. Women who used 8-hour cream from their 20s through their 50s had skin that bore the visible evidence of decades of consistent occlusive protection, and the product's reputation was spread entirely by this visible evidence rather than by any particular advertising elegance. It looked exactly like what it was, smelled faintly of petroleum and lanolin, and cost considerably more than Pond's. The women who used it considered the price appropriate to the results, and they were not wrong. The sunburn treatment is the final item on the cold cream shelf that deserves its own moment of attention, because the 1950s relationship to sun exposure represents one of the most dramatic shifts in cosmetic and health understanding of the subsequent century. The medicine cabinet of 1953 did not contain sunscreen, not because such products did not exist in any form. Coppertone was producing sun products throughout the decade, but because the product purpose was widely understood as acceleration rather than prevention. Coppertone in the early 1950s was sold as a tanning oil. Its purpose was to help the skin develop an even deep tan more quickly and with fewer of the uneven patches that unassisted sun exposure produced. The deep tan was the mark of leisure and health in the post-war decade. The pale complexion that the 19th century had valued as a mark of gentility had been entirely displaced, and the woman who emerged from a summer at the beach or the backyard with brown arms and a freckled nose was displaying exactly the right markers of a well-lived summer. What her medicine cabinet stocked for the consequence of this philosophy was not prevention but treatment. The calamine lotion for the burnt shoulders, the cold cream applied liberally to the peeling nose, and the understanding that this cycle was simply a feature of summer, rather than a consequence of a health risk. The sunscreen revolution was still 2 decades away. In the meantime, the cold cream did double duty. The significance of zinc oxide in the cold cream formulations of the 1950s is a detail that appears with some frequency in the beauty column discussions of the era, but which has been largely forgotten in subsequent accounts. The zinc oxide that Pond's and several competing formulations included as a secondary ingredient served as a mild astringent and a physical sun filter, its light-scattering properties reducing ultraviolet exposure to the skin without the woman wearing it being aware that any sun protection was occurring. In 1953, this was not marketed as a UV protective feature because the concept of sun damage as a cause of premature skin aging had not been publicly established in anything approaching its modern form. The zinc oxide was in the formula for its cosmetic smoothing effect and its mild antiseptic properties. That it was simultaneously providing modest photoprotection is a pleasant historical irony that speaks to the accidental wisdom embedded in some of the mid-century formulations. The women who used these creams consistently for decades were doing something useful for their skin's long-term health through a mechanism their manufacturers had not identified and their users did not know about. If you wanted to understand what a woman genuinely feared in 1953, you did not look at her diary. You looked at the second shelf of her medicine cabinet, the one behind the cold cream, the one that took a moment of deliberate reaching to access. This shelf was the private pharmacy. It held the aspirin and the iodine, the milk of magnesia and the anakin tablets, and quite often a small amber bottle of something that was not precisely a medicine but was not precisely not one either. This shelf told the truth about a woman's health in a decade when the truth was not something discussed openly, even with a doctor. Aspirin was the undisputed monarch of the 1950s medicine shelf. Bayer had been producing acetyl salicylic acid for American consumers since 1901, but the post-war decade elevated aspirin to a status that bordered on the devotional. The marketing campaigns of the early 1950s positioned aspirin not merely as a pain reliever, but as a general restorative, something to be taken at the first sign of fatigue, at the onset of a social headache, at the beginning of monthly discomfort. Advertisements in women's magazines showed housewives reaching for aspirin with the same casual authority with which they reached for the percolator. It was normalized not as medication but as maintenance. Anacin ran a particularly aggressive advertising campaign throughout the mid-1950s that deserves examination as a cultural artifact in its own right. The Anacin advertisements, both print and the new medium of television, were built around a three-pronged claim that anakin contained not one but a combination of medically active ingredients, the aspirin and caffeine, and a buffer that was somewhat vaguely described, that this combination worked faster than aspirin alone, and that this speed was particularly important because the modern housewife's headache was a specific and urgent medical event requiring equally specific and urgent treatment. The housewife's headache, in other words, was not a symptom of overwork or domestic stress. It was a technical problem solvable by the correct pharmaceutical compound. This framing was commercially brilliant and philosophically revealing in equal measure. Below the aspirin and its branded competitors sat the iodine in a small amber dropper bottle sealed with a stopper. Iodine was the wound treatment of first resort throughout the 1950s, applied to cuts, scrapes, and minor burns with a cheerful deliberateness that would horrify modern emergency medicine practitioners. The dark amber stain it left on skin was, in many households, a mark of practical competence rather than injury. A child showing up to school with iodine-stained fingers had been properly attended to. The sting, which was considerable, was considered instructive rather than excessive. Pain, in 1953, remained a meaningful signal rather than an experience to be immediately eliminated. Milk of magnesia occupied the shelf with a kind of dependable quietness. Philip's milk of magnesia, in its distinctive blue glass bottle, was the digestive corrective for a decade defined by extraordinarily heavy cooking. The 1950s housewife was feeding her family on substantial quantities of red meat, thick gravies, casseroles built on condensed cream of mushroom soup, and desserts that required a full cup of butter. The digestive consequences of this diet were real and recurring, and milk of magnesia addressed them with the alkaline simplicity of magnesium hydroxide suspended in water. It tasted of nothing in particular and worked with a mild, reliable efficiency. Every medicine cabinet had one. The bottle lasted years because you did not consume it frivolously. You reached for it when the situation genuinely warranted it, and not a moment sooner. The amber bottle that required no description in 1953 but requires considerable explanation now was Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. Lydia Pinkham had been producing her vegetable compound since 1873, and by the 1950s it occupied an extraordinary cultural position, known to every woman, discussed in particular tones, and consumed with a combination of mild embarrassment and genuine gratitude. The compound's formula included black cohosh, life root, pleurisy root, and fenugreek, suspended in an alcohol solution that gave the product an assertive warmth upon consumption. It was marketed as a remedy for menstrual discomfort, menopausal symptoms, and general female debility, and its effectiveness was a matter of energetic debate that nobody particularly wanted to have in public. Women who used it did not, as a rule, advertise the fact. They also did not stop buying it. What these products collectively reveal is a medicine cabinet organized around symptom management rather than preventive care, and around self-sufficient treatment rather than professional consultation. The 1950s woman went to a doctor for serious illness, for the ordinary biological textures of daily life, the headaches, the menstrual pain, the digestive heaviness, the minor wounds. She managed herself from this shelf with a competence born of necessity. The healthcare system of the post-war decade was not designed to engage with ordinary feminine discomfort. The medicine cabinet was, in many ways, the healthcare system. The modern equivalents of this shelf, the Tylenol and Advil, the Pepto-Bismol and the Zantac, have, if anything, multiplied in number while shrinking in pharmaceutical mystery. We have lost the amber bottle of something almost but not quite medicine. We have gained extraordinary precision in pain management and genuine understanding of the mechanisms of the drugs we take. What we have not replaced is the particular domestic competence of the 1950s woman who looked at her shelf and knew exactly what to reach for and why, and how much. Her pharmacy was small and its logic was clear. She was the household clinician, and she ran a tight operation. The proprietary tonic bottles deserve their own extended examination, because they represent a category of American medicine cabinet product that was simultaneously commercial, psychological, and just barely pharmacological, existing in the interpretive gap between food, medicine, and personal ritual, in ways that the modern FDA regulatory framework would find enormously difficult to classify. Hadacol was the most spectacular example of this category in the early 1950s. Produced by Louisiana politician Dudley LeBlanc and containing 14% alcohol, along with B vitamins and a roster of minerals, in quantities that were pharmacologically inert individually, but which together produced, in combination with the alcohol, a sense of general well-being that its consumers found genuinely restorative. LeBlanc's marketing, which involved a travelling Hadacol caravan featuring Hollywood entertainers and appeared more like a political campaign than a product launch, made Hadacol a national cultural phenomenon before financial mismanagement collapsed the operation in 1952. The Hadacol bottles that remained on medicine cabinet shelves throughout the early part of the decade were relics of this peculiar episode, and women who had bought them and found them moderately useful for reasons they could not quite specify continued to work through their supply with the pragmatic loyalty of the era. The headache powders that competed with aspirin tablets on the analgesic shelf were another product category with a complicated history. BC Powder and Goodies Powder, both southern regional products that achieved significant national distribution through the 1950s, contained aspirin, caffeine, and salicylamide in a loose powder form that could be poured directly onto the tongue and washed down with water or stirred into a glass of liquid. The rationale for powder over tablet was absorption speed. A dissolved powder reached the bloodstream faster than a tablet that required disintegration in the stomach before absorption could begin. This claim was substantially accurate, and women who dealt with severe menstrual headaches in the 1950s found the powder preparations genuinely more effective at acute symptom management than the tablet alternatives. The paper packets of headache powder, folded and sealed, looked like nothing so much as the ingredients for a very small recipe, and they lived in the medicine cabinet in their small cardboard box with the particular orderly efficiency of a product that knew its job and performed it without ceremony. The digestive enzymes and bile salt preparations that occupied the lower shelf, alongside milk of magnesia, reflected the dietary reality of the 1950s kitchen with great precision. A diet built around organ meats, whole milk, cream sauces, and desserts requiring multiple eggs and cups of butter produced a digestive demand that the liver and pancreas sometimes struggled to meet with their natural enzyme production. The proprietary digestive preparations of the era, Eno fruit salt, a British import that had found a considerable American following through the 1940s, or the American equivalent preparations from Squibb and McKesson, were built around bile salt extracts and pancreatic enzyme concentrates that supplemented the body's own digestive chemistry for the heaviest meals. The woman who served pot roast with gravy and a butter cake for dessert every Sunday kept something on the shelf for Sunday evening. This was not weakness. This was planning. The Epsom salts in their large cardboard canister were perhaps the most quietly omnipresent item on the remedies shelf, used across a range of applications with a versatility that kept the canister in continuous partial use. A warm Epsom salt foot soak at the end of a Saturday spent in heels, a warm compress on a strained muscle, added to the bath when illness or fatigue accumulated beyond what sleep alone could address. The magnesium sulfate in Epsom salts does in fact provide genuine relief to fatigued muscles when absorbed transdermally during a warm soak. This is not simply folk medicine but real chemistry, and women who kept the canister on the bottom shelf and used it regularly were, without knowing the mechanism, delivering genuine magnesium supplementation through the most pleasant possible route. The canister that lived in the medicine cabinet in 1953 was typically the same canister that was there in 1956, slowly depleted and eventually replaced, a reliable presence on the shelf whose constancy was itself a small comfort. The positioning of analgesics for women in the post-war decade operated within a broader cultural conversation about women's pain and its credibility that remains remarkably continuous with contemporary debates. The menstrual pain that drove a significant portion of aspirin and anisine consumption among women of the era was consistently described in medical literature as psychosomatic or exaggerated. The idea that severe primary dysmenorrhea was a reflection of emotional rather than physiological disturbance had genuine medical endorsement through the 1940s and into the 50s. This meant that a woman managing what was, in many cases, genuine prostaglandin-driven uterine cramping was managing it, not with medical sympathy, but with the over-the-counter products on her medicine cabinet shelf and the stoic domestic philosophy of her generation. The aspirin worked because aspirin works. Its mechanism of prostaglandin inhibition, while not yet understood in 1953, was pharmacologically real and effective. She used it in the doses the packaging recommended she got through Tuesday, and she did not discuss the particulars with her physician because her physician's available response was limited and sometimes insulting. The Alka-Seltzer tablet's fizzing ceremony deserves its own cultural moment, because the dissolution of the tablet in the glass of water was in the 1950s a genuinely theatrical domestic event. The 2 white tablets dropped into the glass with a satisfying click, and the effervescence that immediately followed was vigorous and precise, not the uncertain fizz of a carbonated beverage poured carelessly, but a chemical event with a clear beginning, middle, and end. You watched it complete its work. You drank it while it was still slightly fizzing because the instructions suggested this was optimal. The whole operation took perhaps 3 minutes, and in those 3 minutes the household's resident pharmacist had diagnosed a problem, selected a therapeutic response, prepared it, and administered it. The Alka-Seltzer tablet was the most performatively satisfying product on the 1950s medicine shelf, and its commercial longevity into the 21st century is at least partly a tribute to the irreplaceable quality of that fizzing theatre. A woman in 1954 did not put on her face, she constructed it. The distinction matters. Putting on a face implies speed, improvisation, the rapid assembly of something approximate. Constructing a face was an architectural undertaking, layered, sequenced, and governed by a logic as precise as any engineering specification. And the components of that construction lived not on a bathroom counter but in the medicine cabinet, lined up in an order that reflected the sequence of their application with the straightforward efficiency of a surgical tray. The foundation of this construction, literally and practically, was the cake or pancake makeup that Max Factor had introduced to the civilian market in 1940, and which had by the early 1950s become the defining cosmetic technology of the decade. Max Factor's Pancake Foundation, originally developed for Technicolor film production, where grease paint read as garish and theatrical under the new cameras, turned out to be precisely what the civilian market wanted, a product that applied smoothly, dried matte, and gave the skin a photographic quality that grease paint could not approximate. It came in a round compact with a slightly damp sponge, and its application was a practiced operation. You wetted the sponge lightly, not soaking, never soaking, the instruction was explicit, and you picked up the pigment in small circular motions, then pressed it into the skin in a specific directional sequence. Forehead first, then cheeks, then nose, then chin, in overlapping coverage that eliminated visible pores and created the even, flattened surface on which everything else would be applied. The rouge that sat beside the foundation compact was a product whose history is considerably more interesting than its diminutive presence on the shelf might suggest. The word rouge itself was culturally loaded in the post-war decade in ways that are difficult to reconstruct accurately from a modern vantage point. Rouging had been associated with theatrical women, with women of questionable morality, and with elderly women who were fighting an undignified battle against pallor. All of these associations traced back through the Victorian era and earlier. The post-war beauty industry had spent considerable effort repositioning it as blush, as natural colour, as the suggestion of exercise-induced warmth rather than artificial enhancement. By 1952, the Rouge Pot was called a blush compact in polite cosmetic terminology, and its application instructions specified placement that mimicked the natural bloom of cold air on healthy cheeks. The technology had not changed. The framing had changed entirely. Dorothy Gray and Harriet Hubbard Eyre produced rouge compacts in a beautiful range of coral, rose and raspberry tones that occupied the medicine cabinet with a faint powdery fragrance. The compact cases themselves were objects worth examining. Pressed powder rouge came in cases of polished metal, often silver or gold-toned, with a small mirror and a tiny velvet puff attached. The puff was replaced regularly. A worn puff was a sign of cosmetic negligence, and a well-stocked medicine cabinet kept a small supply of replacement puffs, folded in waxed paper in the back of the cabinet, ready to be pressed into service. The powder shelf was the most populated shelf in the medicine cabinet, and its population was strictly organized. Face powder sat separate from body powder. Loose face powder, Coty's Airspun in its distinctive round cardboard box, or Richard Hudnut's 3 Flower in its elegant glass jar, was a different formulation from the talcum powder that went on the body after bathing. Face powder was finely milled to a degree that body talc was not. It contained oil-absorbing ingredients, pigments calibrated to 6 or 7 widely available complexion shades, and a setting capacity that locked the underlying cream foundation in place for hours. The application of face powder was not optional. A woman who appeared in public in her foundation alone, without powder set over it, had technically not finished dressing. This was understood without discussion. Coty's Airspun deserves particular attention as a cultural object because it occupied such a specific and beloved place in the cosmetic landscape of the 1950s. The box, which had barely changed since its introduction in 1935, was a round cardboard cylinder wrapped in pale cream paper with a delicate pastel print and sealed with a flat metal lid. The powder inside was extraordinarily fine, so fine that it genuinely appeared to float when tapped from its large powder puff, which accounted for the Airspun name. The fragrance was light, sweet, and distinctly of its era. There is a particular quality to 1940s and 50s cosmetic fragrance, a warmth that modern products cannot quite replicate. Women who grew up in households where their mothers used Airspun will recognize the scent immediately, decades later, as one of the most emotionally specific olfactory triggers available to human memory. The eyebrow pencil lived on the powder shelf too, usually tucked in a small glass or ceramic holder, alongside the eye pencils and the mascara wand. The 1950s eyebrow was a very particular architectural achievement, drawn high and narrow, arched dramatically, and extended beyond the natural brow line at both ends to create a shape that bore little resemblance to what nature had actually provided. Helena Rubinstein's eyebrow pencils and Elizabeth Arden's equivalents were the tools of this construction. The pencil was sharpened to a very fine point and applied with the same disciplined hand control with which a draftsman approaches a technical drawing. A poorly executed eyebrow in 1953 was not merely an aesthetic failure, it was a practical failure, evidence that the construction of the face had not been executed with sufficient care. The mascara of the period, this is the detail that most surprises modern readers, was not a tube with a wand. It was a small rectangular cake of compressed black or brown pigment, packaged in a fold-out cardboard case, applied with a small spiral brush that was wetted before use. Maybelline had been producing mascara in this format since the 1920s, and by the 1950s the technique of wetting the cake brush, wiping the excess on the inside edge of the case, and applying the product with precise upward strokes was as standardized a morning operation as buttering toast. The mascara cake lived in the medicine cabinet in its flat cardboard case, and it was replenished with some frequency because the application technique, wetting, loading, stroking, was not a gentle process for the product. A finished mascara cake, worn down to a thin residue in its case, was a mark of regular, competent use. What all of these products together reveal is a morning ritual that was simultaneously more labour-intensive and more precise than anything the modern beauty consumer typically undertakes, executed with materials that required skill, practice, and a steady hand. The powder shelf of the 1950s medicine cabinet was not stocked for convenience, it was stocked for construction. The eyebrow pencil merits considerably more examination than its modest shelf presence might suggest, because the eyebrow in the 1950s was not merely groomed. It was constructed from a slightly different geometric premise than the natural brow occupied. The natural brow, with its tendency toward fullness at the inner corner and gradual tapering toward the temple, was considered in 1953 to be a starting point rather than a destination. The destination was the thin, high-arched line that stretched from just inside the natural brow's inner corner to a point well beyond its outer terminal, creating an expression of permanent mild surprise that the era somehow read as elegant rather than startled. This shape required first the removal or suppression of the natural brow through tweezing and threading, and then the drawing of the desired shape above or slightly inside the natural line with a pencil sharpened to a fine, consistent point. Helena Rubinstein's brow pencils were considered the professional quality option on the drugstore shelf in the early 1950s, a reputation built partly on the persuasive force of Rubinstein's own public persona as a cosmetic authority of international credentials, and partly on the genuine quality of the product's consistency. It went on smoothly without the skipping or breaking that cheaper pencils produced. The technique prescribed in the women's magazine beauty columns of the era involved short, upward feathering strokes rather than a single drawn line, the theory being that feathered application mimicked the appearance of actual hair growth and gave the finished brow a somewhat more natural appearance than the drawn line. Whether the feathered brow actually looked natural to an observer is a question that period photographs answer with some honesty. It did not particularly, but it looked like an eyebrow, which in 1953 was the relevant standard. The mascara cake's position on the medicine cabinet shelf tells an interesting story about the relationship between cosmetic technology and consumer ritual. The cake format, a small pressed rectangle of wax, pigment and soap compounds, required the user to engage actively with the product in a way that the tube and wand format that Maybelline introduced in its Great Lash Mascara in 1971 entirely eliminated. You wetted the brush, you worked it into the cake, you checked the load on the back of your hand, you applied with a specific wrist motion that varied between individuals according to the particular geometry of their lashes and the effect they were attempting to create. This sequence of deliberate, practiced actions made mascara application a skill rather than a routine, and women who had developed their own technique over years of daily practice applied their mascara with a precision and confidence that the wand-from-tube format, while vastly more convenient, simply does not require. The eyeshadow that joined the mascara and pencil on the cosmetic section of the medicine cabinet was substantially different in formulation from modern pressed powder eyeshadow. The 1950s eyeshadow was typically a cream or grease-based product in a small pot, available in a range of shades that were considerably less varied than the modern shadow market, mainly blue, green, brown and grey, with lavender an occasional adventurous choice for evening wear. The cream texture applied with the fingertip rather than a brush, depositing pigment that blended with the warm temperature of the skin and dried to a slightly powdery finish. The colour statement of the 1950s eye was relatively modest compared to the theatrical eye looks that would arrive with the 1960s. Shadow was a subtle shading tool, not a graphic element. Its purpose was to make the eye appear larger and more lustrous, not to function as an art medium. The lip liner pencil, which would become a staple of late 20th century cosmetic practice, was in its 1950s form a more rudimentary tool. A red pencil, sometimes the same pencil used for the brow, applied just outside or just inside the natural lip line before the lipstick to create a crisp border that prevented the waxy lipstick formula from feathering into the small lines around the mouth. The feathering problem was real and pervasive in the 1950s because the lipstick formulations of the era used a higher wax content than subsequent decades would employ, and this wax had a tendency to migrate into fine lines over several hours of wear. The lip liner pencil solved this problem with mechanical precision, a physical barrier of harder pigment pencil that the softer wax lipstick could not cross. The technique required practice and a reasonably steady hand, but the women of 1953 had steady hands. They'd been drawing things carefully in their faces since their early teens. The geometry of the 1950s eye was governed by a set of proportional principles that the beauty columnists articulated with an architectural confidence suggesting that these were natural laws rather than cultural conventions. The ideal eye shape, according to the consensus of the beauty advice literature between 1950 and 1958, was almond-shaped, with the outer corner slightly elevated and the inner corner clean and angular. Eyes that did not naturally approximate this shape were understood as correctable through a specific application protocol, darkening the outer corner to elongate the round eye, widening the inner corner liner application to open the close-set eye, and the systematic use of the upper lash line to establish a dominance of horizontal emphasis that the eye's natural shape did not independently provide. The women who followed these instructions in front of their bathroom mirrors each morning were engaged in a precise geometric undertaking that required practice, skill, and an honest assessment of their own features that many women found uncomfortable. The beauty columns offered the correction technique as a gift. The implicit message behind the technique was that the uncorrected face was inadequate. In 1951, Colgate ran an advertisement in Life magazine that became one of the most analytically interesting pieces of post-war commercial culture. It showed a woman, beautiful, well-dressed, clearly successful in the social codes of the era, standing slightly outside a social gathering, her expression carrying a specific quality of anxious exclusion. The headline read, "The problem she doesn't know she has." The problem, the body copy explained, was her breath. She had not done anything wrong. She had brushed her teeth, presumably with something, but she had not brushed them with Colgate, and this failure, which she herself was unaware of, was costing her social standing, romantic prospects, and professional opportunity in ways she could not perceive but that others could. It was, in miniature, the entire post-war American marketing strategy, the invention of a deficit the consumer did not know existed, followed immediately by the solution. The oral hygiene section of the 1950s medicine cabinet was a battlefield of competing commercial anxieties, and the products that populated it had been placed there not merely by preference, but by carefully engineered social terror. Halitosis, a clinical term that was essentially invented as a marketing tool by Listerine in the 1920s, and which had by the 1950s sunk deep into the cultural subconscious, was the central organizing fear. It did not matter that the science of breath odor was considerably more complicated than the toothpaste advertisement suggested. What mattered was that the fear of being the woman in the Colgate advertisement, unknowingly excluded from her own social life, was sufficient to generate daily, twice daily, sometimes thrice daily engagement with the products on this shelf. The toothpaste itself, Colgate Ribbon Dental Cream, or Apena with its cheerful Bucky Beaver mascot, or Crest, which entered the market in 1955 with the groundbreaking endorsement of the American Dental Association, came in aluminum tubes that were squeezed from the bottom with a deliberateness that the housewife applied to very few other domestic tasks. The toothbrush of the era was a straight-handled instrument with natural bristles, or increasingly, the new synthetic nylon bristles that DuPont had begun producing in the 1930s and which were gaining acceptance as a more hygienic alternative to the natural bristle versions that retained moisture and bacteria between uses. The nylon bristled brush was a genuine public health improvement, and its adoption through the 1950s was one of those quiet, unremarked upon technological transitions that had real effects on human health at the population level. Listerine occupied the glass shelf of the medicine cabinet with the particular authority of a product that has defined its own category. It arrived in 1914 as a surgical antiseptic, was repositioned in the 1920s as a mouthwash, and by the 1950s was so thoroughly identified with oral hygiene that its amber colour and sharp antiseptic taste were themselves reassuring. Sensory confirmation that something medically meaningful was happening. The burn of Listerine on the gum line, the sharp phenol bite at the back of the throat, the clean chemical clarity that followed. These were not pleasant exactly, but they were interpretable as efficacy. If it stings, it works. This remains one of the most durable and empirically questionable beliefs in consumer healthcare, and Listerine built an empire on it. The denture adhesive that lived in the back corner of many 1950s medicine cabinets is worth acknowledging, not because dentures were unusual in the era. They were remarkably common given the dental care available to previous generations, but because the management of this reality was conducted with a very specific domestic discretion. Polident and Fixodent occupied their shelf space with a quiet practicality. The woman who had dentures dealt with this fact as she dealt with most physical maintenance, efficiently, privately, and without drama. The medicine cabinet was the space in which these private maintenance operations occurred. It was not discussed, and it did not need to be. The tooth whitening products of the 1950s are an interesting historical footnote because they reveal how differently the era thought about dental aesthetics. The pearlescent, uniformly brilliant smile that has become the contemporary American beauty standard did not exist as an aspiration in 1953. Teeth were expected to be clean and free of visible decay. They were not expected to be particularly white. The whitening preparations that existed, a paste of baking soda and hydrogen peroxide applied occasionally, or Ipana's gentle abrasive formulation, were not pursuing a cosmetic standard but a cleanliness standard. The distinction is significant. Cleanliness was a moral category in the 1950s. White teeth as cosmetic performance was a substantially later development. Beneath the toothpaste and mouthwash lived the dental floss in its small round metal dispenser, and it must be acknowledged with some honesty that 1950s medicine cabinets often contained dental floss, primarily for the same reason they contained certain other items on other shelves, because it was the correct thing to have, because not having it would be evidence of inadequate domestic standards, and because Dr. Charles Bayes had spent the previous decade writing persuasively about its importance and his arguments had filtered into the mainstream home economics curriculum. Whether the floss was consistently used is a separate question. The point is that it was there, and that its presence on the shelf was itself a small, quiet declaration of domestic adequacy. What the oral hygiene shelf of the 1950s medicine cabinet reveals most plainly is that the management of social anxiety through commercial products is not a recent development in American consumer culture. The women who carefully restocked their Listerine and replaced their worn nylon bristle toothbrushes every 3 months were responding to the same fundamental commercial message that drives today's whitening strip consumer. You are one product purchase away from social confidence, or at least one product short of it. The specific products change. The underlying architecture of marketed insufficiency does not. The stomach powders and digestive aids of the 1950s represent an interesting pharmacological history that connects the medicine cabinet directly to the dietary culture of the era. Alka-Seltzer, introduced in 1931 by the Dr. Miles Medical Company, had achieved by the early 1950s a cultural saturation that made its distinctive fizzing sound one of the recognizable auditory signatures of American domestic life. The product, aspirin and sodium bicarbonate compressed into a tablet that released carbon dioxide when dropped into water, producing the effervescent drink, addressed the American Sunday dinner with impressive efficiency. You ate, you overate, you returned to the kitchen an hour later and dropped 2 tablets into a glass, and you stood at the sink listening to the fizz resolve itself, and then drank the slightly salty, slightly medicinal solution with the practical satisfaction of a problem being addressed in real time. The aspirin addressed the headache that often accompanied excess. The bicarbonate addressed the gastric acid surplus. The carbonation addressed nothing pharmacologically, but made the whole thing feel more like a treatment and less like a surrender. The laxatives that occupied a corner of the digestive shelf with some regularity in 1950s medicine cabinets represent a separate category of digestive management that reflects both the actual dietary fiber content of the era's cuisine, which was relatively low by the standards of what nutritional science would subsequently recommend, and a cultural anxiety about digestive regularity that the advertising of the period had elevated to something approaching a moral concern. X-Lax, in its chocolate-flavoured laxative squares that presented as indistinguishable from confectionery, was the most familiar brand, and its packaging was specifically designed to reduce the embarrassment of purchase. Fletcher's Castoria for children and various mineral oil preparations for adults addressed what the era's health literature consistently identified as a primary health concern. The prevalence of constipation in the 1950s was not imaginary. A diet of refined white flour, red meat, and few vegetables genuinely produces the consequence that these products addressed. But the advertising anxiety around the issue considerably exceeded what the medical literature would have independently generated. The cold preparation shelf, the Vicks Vapor Rub, the Vicks Inhaler, the assorted nasal decongestant preparations that filled the space between the aspirin and the iodine, was a subset of the medicine cabinet that expanded dramatically in the winter months and contracted somewhat in summer. Vicks Vapor Rub was in every sense a 1950s household institution, a stiff mentholated petroleum jelly in its familiar dark blue jar that was applied to the chest and throat of anyone showing respiratory symptoms with a confidence that exceeded its demonstrable pharmacological mechanism. The menthol and camphor and eucalyptus oil created a powerful sensory impression of respiratory ease that was not entirely illusory. The oils did in fact function as mild topical irritants that stimulated mucous membrane secretion, but the primary therapeutic mechanism was more likely the warmth of the adult hand applying it and the smell of caring that permeated the sick room. The Vaporub jar, opened in a closed bedroom on a winter night, released an atmosphere so specific and so thoroughly associated with being cared for while ill that its smell has, for generations of Americans, never fully separated from the warmth of childhood illness tended by a competent parent. The throat lozenges, Luden's Wild Cherry, Smith Brothers Black, the menthol-forward Halls which arrived in the American market in 1960 and would not become a fixture until the following decade, occupied a separate small section of the cold preparation shelf with the pragmatic cheerfulness of products that were essentially flavoured sugar with varying concentrations of anaesthetic and antiseptic compounds. The benzocaine in the prescription-strength throat lozenges provided real topical analgesia. The menthol in the commercial preparations provided the same powerful sensory impression of cooling and clearing that made Vicks VapoRub feel effective. The wild cherry flavouring in Luden's provided primarily the comfort of sweetness in an unpleasant situation, which is not nothing. Children's medicine cabinets of the era contained considerably more Luden's than the therapeutic category strictly required, because the lozenges were genuinely pleasant, and because a mother who kept Luden's on the shelf could respond to the minor sore throat of a child with something that the child experienced as simultaneously medicine and treat. The intersection of the diet culture products and the regular pharmaceutical products on the 1950s medicine cabinet shelf is worth noting explicitly, because the overlap was considerable, and the boundary between the two categories was frequently unclear. Dexedrine, amphetamine sulfate, a prescription weight loss medication that doctors were prescribing with considerable liberality through the 1950s to women who wanted to lose weight, lived on the prescription shelf alongside the penicillin and the Premarin, and its presence on the shelf was not coded differently from the other prescription products. It was a medication, prescribed by a doctor, taken as directed. That it was also a potent stimulant with significant dependency potential was a fact that the prescribing culture of the era had not yet fully integrated into its risk framework. The Dexedrine prescription on the medicine cabinet shelf is one of the more historically complex items in the cabinet's inventory, sitting at the intersection of the diet culture, the pharmaceutical expansion of the post-war decade, and the specific medical treatment of women's bodies and women's weight that the era conducted with a confidence that subsequent understanding has thoroughly complicated. The gelatin-based diet preparations that appeared on the medicine cabinet shelf, alongside the dietary products of the 1950s, reflect a specific nutritional mythology of the era that the popular diet literature propagated with considerable confidence. Knox unflavoured gelatin, stirred into fruit juice and consumed as a daily supplement, was widely recommended in the beauty columns as a nail-strengthening treatment and a dietary addition that increased protein availability for hair and skin. The keratin theory underlying this recommendation, that dietary gelatin's glycine and proline content provided the amino acid building blocks for keratin protein synthesis in the nail and hair, was plausible as a hypothesis, but has since been substantially unsupported by clinical research. What the gelatin tablet did reliably was provide a modest caloric addition to a diet that the calorie-counting manuals of the decade were often making rather severely restrictive, and the nutritional supplement function, accidental as it was, may have been the gelatin's genuinely useful contribution to the beauty routines that prescribed it. The perfume bottle was not stored in the medicine cabinet. Let us be precise about this from the outset, because the distinction matters to understanding what the medicine cabinet actually was. The perfume bottle, whether it was Chanel No. 5 in its legendary modernist rectangular flacon, or Guerlain's Shalimar with its blue and gold fan stopper, or Jean Patou's Joy, which was marketed in the early 1950s as the most expensive perfume in the world, lived on the vanity table in the bedroom, where it could be seen and where its use was a deliberate ceremonial act that preceded leaving the house. The medicine cabinet was a functional space. The vanity was a ceremonial one. What lived in the medicine cabinet on the shelf below the powder and beside the aspirin was the perfume's humbler household. the cologne, the toilet water, the dusting powder, the scented talc, and the solid perfume compact that a woman kept available for quick freshening without the occasion weight of her good scent. And this collection of secondary fragrance products is, if anything, more revealing of the 1950s scent culture than the perfume itself, because these were the products of daily use rather than special occasion, and daily use is where cultural values actually live. Coty's Le Monde dusting powder was a staple of the medicine cabinet shelf throughout the decade. It came in a round box with a large soft puff, and it was applied after bathing with an arm-sweeping generosity that left a light powdery fragrance on the skin and a certain luminous quality to the texture of whatever fabric touched it next. The Le Monde fragrance, a soft floral with a warm, slightly soapy base, was the olfactory signature of dressed femininity in a way that no single modern product quite matches. It was not the scent itself that was remarkable, but the ritual of its application. The open box on the bathroom shelf, the puff lifted and patted across shoulders and arms, and the décolletage, the light fall of the white powder in the morning light. It was a specifically feminine morning gesture, unrushed and unironic, and it belongs to a daily ritual culture that has largely dissolved. The toilet water, eau de toilette in the continental terminology that some American brands were beginning to adopt, though the domestic term remained cologne water through most of the decade, was an intermediate product that served as the everyday fragrance for women who reserved their concentrated perfume for evenings. Avon was producing toilet waters in a staggering variety of floral, fruity and green orientations throughout the 1950s, available through the direct sales model that sent Avon representatives door to door through American suburbs with sample cases and order forms. The Avon toilet water bottle was typically a pressed glass flacon of some modest elegance, and it occupied the medicine cabinet shelf with the quiet competence of a product that knew its place and fulfilled it reliably. The solid perfume compact deserves particular attention as a cosmetic object because it represented a specific kind of 1950s practical thinking. Solid perfume was fragrance suspended in a wax base, often beeswax or petrolatum, packaged in a small hinged metal compact, sometimes quite beautiful, sometimes simply functional. It was applied by touching a finger to the surface and then pressing the finger to the pulse points. The inner wrists, the hollow of the throat, the inside of the elbows. It was compact. It did not spill. It did not require a particular time of day or a particular level of ceremony, and it could be carried in a handbag for midday touch-up. Coty and Dorothy Gray both produced solid perfume compacts, and these were among the items in the medicine cabinet that had a genuinely utilitarian elegance, beautiful enough to be worth keeping, practical enough to be used without guilt. The bay rum that lived on many medicine cabinet shelves throughout the 1950s is a product whose gender associations have shifted considerably over the decades. In 1953, bay rum was primarily marketed as a masculine product, an aftershave and skin tonic made from the distilled essential oil of West Indian bay leaves combined with rum and spices. But in households where the medicine cabinet was shared, the bay rum often quietly served as a perfumery ingredient for women who used a few drops in their bath or applied it to pulse points as a spicy, slightly woody base note that complemented a floral perfume in ways that the standard feminine colognes of the era could not. This cross-use was not advertised and not discussed. It was simply a piece of practical domestic creativity that the shared medicine cabinet made possible. The fragrance landscape of the 1950s operated on a different set of cultural assumptions than our own. In the post-war decade, a woman's scent was expected to be consistent, to be identifiable as hers in the way that her handwriting and her posture were hers. The idea of a fragrance wardrobe, of rotating between different perfumes depending on season or mood, was a continental European concept that had not yet fully crossed the Atlantic. An American woman of the middle classes in 1952 had a scent. It was the one she wore to her wedding. It was the one her children associated with her presence years after her death. The bottle might be replaced many times over the decades, but the fragrance itself did not change. This olfactory constancy was considered a form of feminine integrity. The modern relationship to fragrance, experimental, rotational, sometimes entirely absent, sometimes overwhelmingly present, would strike the 1950s woman as curiously unmoored. Fragrance was identity in that decade in a way that has since been redistributed across many other self-presentation choices. Today, a person might express their personality through the aesthetic of their apartment, their social media presence, their dietary choices, their politics. In 1953, the most immediate and continuous expression of who you were was the scent you left in a room after you left it. The dusting powder on the medicine cabinet shelf was the ground note of that identity, available every morning, applied with a large soft puff and a deliberate, unhurried arm. The perfume culture of the 1950s is inseparable from the culture of the department store counter, which was the primary retail venue through which American women encountered and selected their fragrances. The great department store cosmetic counters, at Macy's, at Bloomingdale's, at the regional department stores that anchored every American city's downtown retail district through the post-war decade, were theatrical environments in ways that the modern Sephora or Ulta beauty store does not quite replicate. The counter was staffed by women trained in the specific language of fragrance, trained specifically in the language of gift-giving and occasion matching, that translated the abstract vocabulary of perfumery into the concrete vocabulary of the housewife's social calendar. A fragrance was not merely a fragrance. It was the appropriate choice for a dinner party, the suitable selection for a church social, the right accompaniment for the cocktail dress rather than the daytime suit. The Arpège by Lanvin, presented in a black sphere with a gold neck, one of the most beautiful perfume bottles produced in the 20th century, occupied the medicine cabinet back shelf of women who had received it as a gift with a slightly formal reverence that the bottle's design seemed to demand. Arpège was not the sort of fragrance you applied carelessly. It was floral and complex with a deep aldehyde top note that opened dramatically and settled slowly into a warm woody base. It smelled, to 21st century noses, unmistakably of its era. That particular combination of aldehydes and florals that characterized the great French perfumes of the mid-century, and which has almost entirely disappeared from commercial fragrance production. The women who wore Arpège in 1953 are now in their 90s and hundreds, and when they encounter it in a vintage perfume collection, they experience the same violent olfactory memory that Pond's cold cream triggers, the body remembering a scent it has not encountered in decades with a specificity that verbal description cannot approach. The Elizabeth Arden fragrance collection occupied a slightly different cultural register, more American, more deliberately accessible, without the continental formality of the French imports. Blue Grass, Arden's perennial feminine fragrance, was the kind of scent that could go from the grocery store to the country club without requiring a change of clothes or a change of self-presentation. It was bright without being aggressive, feminine without being cloying, and recognizably a quality product without being prohibitively expensive. The Arden Bluegrass toilet water, as distinct from the perfume concentration, was the medicine cabinet staple. The everyday version of the good scent, used freely where the perfume was used sparingly. The relationship between the perfume and its toilet water was itself culturally instructive in the post-war decade. The perfume was for the important occasions, the toilet water for the ordinary days, and the understanding that ordinary days also warranted fragrance was itself a statement about how the era valued the maintenance of standards as a daily practice rather than a special occasion performance. The cedar blocks and lavender sachets that lived alongside the perfume bottles on the medicine cabinet shelf were technically household maintenance items rather than personal fragrance products, but they belonged to the same sensory category. Cedar blocks were used to discourage moth damage in woolens stored in the wardrobe or cedar chest. Lavender sachets serve the same purpose with a different chemistry, the linalool in lavender oil functioning as a mild insecticide, while adding a floral sweetness to the atmosphere of the storage space. The woman who kept cedar blocks in her medicine cabinet kept them there as a transit point. Fresh blocks from the hardware store stored temporarily beside the perfume and toilet water before distribution to their actual destinations in the wardrobe and blanket chest. The smell of cedar in a medicine cabinet alongside lavender and cold cream was a particular compound fragrance of mid-century domestic competence that visitors to those houses will sometimes encounter, decades later, as an involuntary rush of whole environment recollection. The olfactory system's memory reaches further and faster than any other sensory modality, and it was the medicine cabinet more than any other room in the house where its contents were richest. The hair rinse preparations that lived at the edge of the perfume shelf slightly apart from the main fragrance lineup were a category that addressed the specific problem of post-war water chemistry's effects on rinsed hair. The municipal water of many American cities in the 1950s contained mineral deposits, calcium and magnesium ions primarily, that accumulated on the hair shaft during rinsing and left the finished hair dull, slightly gummy in texture, and resistant to the smoothing that setting lotion and a proper brush out would otherwise achieve. The vinegar rinse, white vinegar diluted in warm water, used as a final rinse after shampooing, was the standard folk remedy for this problem, its mild acidity dissolving the mineral deposits that alkaline hard water deposited and restoring the hair's surface smoothness. The proprietary preparations that existed alongside the vinegar rinse option were more elegantly packaged and more pleasantly fragrant, but their chemistry was essentially the same. Mild acid, water, and sometimes a small amount of conditioning agent to replace some of the oil that the shampooing had removed. The Halo shampoo, marketed as a complete one-step solution that left no residue, addressed the same problem from the other end by formulating a shampoo that deposited less mineral-attracting residue to begin with. The solid cologne preparations that competed with the liquid toilet waters on the medicine cabinet shelf represent a particularly interesting packaging solution to the problem of portability. Solid colognes in the 1950s were formulated around beeswax and petrolatum bases in precisely the same way as solid perfumes, but the fragrance concentrations used were those of a cologne rather than a perfume. Lighter, more diffuse, designed to suggest presence rather than announce it. They came in small tins or hinged metal compacts, and they could be tucked into a handbag or a coat pocket, with none of the spillage anxiety that accompanied even the most securely capped liquid cologne bottle. The Coty Solid cologne preparations of the early 1950s were sold in compacts that matched their powder product packaging in size and aesthetic, allowing a woman to carry a coordinated fragrance and powder, compact in a small bag without either bulging or rattling. This coordination, the matching of fragrance, powder and lipstick across a single product family, was itself a marketing strategy that Coty and Revlon and Max Factor all pursued aggressively in the mid-century. with varying degrees of success. Every medicine cabinet in 1955 contained a box of Johnson & Johnson adhesive bandages that had been there for at minimum a year and a half, and from which somewhere between 4 and 12 strips had been removed over that span of time, in response to the cuts and scrapes that kitchen work, garden maintenance, and the management of small children reliably produced. The bandage box was never quite finished before a new one appeared. It was not the sort of thing you allowed to run out. Running out of bandages was evidence of domestic inattention, and domestic inattention in the 1950s was a failure with social weight. But the bandage box was merely the most visible member of a small first aid ecosystem that occupied one section of the medicine cabinet with a quiet medicinal authority. Beneath and beside it lived the rubbing alcohol, always isopropyl, always in a brown glass bottle sealed with a metal screw cap, used for wound sterilization, for removing adhesive residue from skin, for cooling fevers through application to the temples and wrists, and in some households for cleaning the glass shelves of the medicine cabinet itself, which was considered rather thorough. The cotton balls that accompanied the alcohol lived in a small round glass jar with a metal lid, and they were folded, not loose, giving the jar a neat, intentional appearance when opened. The thermometer was a mercury glass thermometer housed in a small metal case, and its use in 1953 required skill that has since been rendered unnecessary by digital replacements. You shook the thermometer down first, a snapping wrist motion performed 3 or 4 times to drive the mercury below the 98 mark, then placed it under the tongue and held it there with the lips closed for a full 3 minutes, at which point you withdrew it and rotated it slowly in the light until the mercury column was visible. The reading was taken in the light near the window, if the bathroom light was insufficient. Misreading a thermometer in 1953 was a meaningful error. You learned to read one correctly. The Ipecac syrup that sat on the shelf alongside these items was a product whose presence in the 1950s medicine cabinet reflected a risk management calculation that has since been entirely revised. Syrup of Ipecac, an extract from the Ipecacuana plant, induced vomiting reliably and promptly, and it was considered a standard first response to accidental poisoning. Households with children, and most 1950s medicine cabinets were in households with children, kept a small brown bottle of Ipecac as standard equipment. The American Association of Poison Control Centers spent decades recommending its routine availability. The recommendation was reversed in 2003, when research demonstrated that Ipecac-induced vomiting often did not improve outcomes and sometimes worsened them. The bottle on the shelf in 1955 was there in good faith. The calamine lotion was perhaps the most democratically used product on the first aid shelf, applied with a cotton ball or cotton pad to sunburns, insect bites, poison ivy rashes, and the chicken pox blisters of childhood with a pink chalky authority. Calamine's formula, zinc oxide and iron. Oxide suspended in a slightly astringent solution had changed very little since the 19th century, and its cooling effect on irritated skin was genuine and reproducible. It was, like many of the best products on the 1950s medicine shelf, straightforward chemistry doing exactly what it claimed to do without apology or supplementary marketing claims. The camphorated oil that lived in a small bottle at the back of the shelf was one of the great domestic mysteries of the era for those who did not grow up in households that used it. It was mineral oil infused with camphor, and its applications were broadly described as external pain relief, for muscle aches, for arthritic joints, for the chest cold in small children, for whom it was rubbed on the chest and back with a warm hand and then covered with a flannel cloth before bed. Whether the camphor was absorbed transdermally in therapeutically meaningful quantities was a question that 1950s family medicine did not particularly engage with. What was unambiguous was the effect of the ritual: the warm oil, the firm hands, the flannel cloth, the smell of camphor filling a small bedroom while the child lay breathing more easily than before. And this effectiveness, whether chemical or psychological or some inseparable blend of both, was sufficient endorsement. The sulphur ointment in its small round jar was a product of the acne management strategies of the era, applied topically to breakouts with the rationale that sulphur's keratolytic and antibacterial properties would reduce the inflammation and accelerate healing. It smelled, with some specificity, of struck matches. It stained fabric. It worked approximately as advertised, which is to say it was somewhat effective, which put it roughly on par with most of the specialized acne treatments developed in the subsequent 70 years. It was not glamorous, but neither was the condition it addressed, and the 1950s medicine cabinet did not allocate shelf space to glamour on this shelf. This shelf was about function. What defines the first aid section of the 1950s medicine cabinet taken as a whole is an attitude toward medical self-sufficiency that has been thoroughly eroded by the subsequent expansion of both professional healthcare availability and liability awareness. The woman who managed this shelf managed it as a genuinely competent domestic clinician. She knew what each product was for, she knew how to use it correctly, and she knew, this is the crucial point, when to use it and when the situation exceeded the shelf's capacity. The line between home treatment and physician consultation was drawn by experience and common sense rather than by protocol. She crossed it when she needed to. Until then, she managed. The home remedy preparations that occupied the margins of the first aid shelf deserve their own sustained examination, because the 1950s stood at a precise historical juncture where folk remedies and pharmaceutical preparations coexisted on medicine cabinet shelves with a democratic indifference to category that subsequent regulatory history would progressively separate. The camphorated oil and the Bengay and the turpentine liniment that some households still maintained from the previous generation's practice occupied the same shelf space as the Johnson's First Aid Cream and the Merthiolette, and they were applied with equivalent confidence by women who had not distinguished between them on anything more rigorous than the verdict of personal experience. Merthiolate, thimerosal in an alcohol solution, sold under the Eli Lilly brand name, was the orange-tinted antiseptic that replaced iodine in many 1950s medicine cabinets because it stained the skin a distinctive but slightly less aggressive shade and was marketed as a more modern alternative. Like iodine, its antiseptic mechanism was real. Unlike iodine, it would eventually be withdrawn from the over-the-counter market amid concerns about mercury accumulation, though this was decades in the future. In 1953, the amber bottle of Merthiolate was applied to cuts and scrapes with the same cheerful pragmatism that characterized the household's entire engagement with minor wounds. The wound was cleaned, the antiseptic was applied, the bandage was affixed, and the matter was resolved. The smelling salts in their small glass ampule or stoppered bottle occupied a corner of the first aid section with a slightly anachronistic dignity, a product whose primary use had declined significantly since the Victorian era's fashion for women fainting, but whose residual presence in the medicine cabinet reflected the era's reluctance to discard items of potential emergency value. Aromatic ammonia spirits, the clinical formulation of what smelling salts contained, did have a genuine reflex-stimulating effect when inhaled. The sharp ammonia caused an involuntary inhalation reflex, and a brief increase in respiratory rate and heart rate that was useful in genuine cases of vasovagal syncope. Whether the average 1950s housewife encountered such cases with sufficient frequency to justify keeping them on the shelf is debatable, but keeping them was part of the responsible domestic philosophy of emergency preparedness that governed the medicine cabinet's entire organization. The witch hazel bottle, Dickinson's was the standard brand, available at every pharmacy, was a product of considerable versatility that occupied its shelf space with the practical authority of something genuinely useful. Witch hazel extract, produced from the bark and leaves of the Hamamelis virginiana shrub through steam distillation and bottled in an alcohol solution, was applied to minor cuts and abrasions as a mild astringent, to insect bites for their cooling tannin effect, to the temples and forehead during fever for its evaporative cooling properties, and to the face after shaving or facial cleansing as a toning preparation that the skin interpreted through the brief contraction of its surface vessels as a feeling of tightness and freshness. It was inexpensive, it didn't expire, it smelled clean and astringent, and it had a genuinely useful chemistry. The witch hazel bottle was one of the medicine cabinet staples that the subsequent decades have not improved upon. The product available today is functionally identical to what sat on the shelf in 1953, which is itself testimony to the adequacy of the original formulation. The rubber hot water bottle that lived at the bottom of the medicine cabinet or in the bathroom closet directly adjacent to it was the thermal therapy instrument of the era. It was filled from the tap, not boiling water, the rubber could not withstand it, but water from the hot side of the tap, which in most 1950s American homes reached temperatures of between 115 and 125 degrees Fahrenheit, wrapped in a cloth cover or a folded towel, and applied to the abdomen for menstrual cramps, to the lower back for muscle strain, to the feet on cold winter nights when circulation was insufficient to warm them independently. It was replaced when the rubber became brittle and began to seep, which happened every several years, and the replacement was not an occasion that required particular acknowledgement. You bought a new one at the pharmacy, you filled it at the tap, and you continued. The hot compress preparations that the medicine cabinet indirectly supplied through its combination of a rubber hot water bottle and various medicinal herbs deserve examination as a first aid practice that was considerably more sophisticated in its physiological understanding than the century that preceded it. The application of moist heat to inflamed or strained tissue, whether through the rubber bottle's warmth, through a washcloth soaked in water to which witch hazel or Epsom salts had been added, or through the commercial clay-based heat packs that some households maintained, was understood at the practical level to increase local blood flow, relax muscle spasm, and reduce the perception of pain. This understanding was correct. The mechanisms were less well articulated in 1953 than they are today, but the treatment was genuinely effective, and the household first aid traditions of the era included a sophistication about thermal therapy that the modern tendency toward immediate pharmaceutical intervention has somewhat displaced. The woman who applied a warm compress to a strained back muscle in the 1950s was doing something useful, and she was doing it with the confidence of a domestic medical tradition that spanned generations. The adhesive tape that lived beside the bandages on the first aid shelf was a product whose history is deeply intertwined with the history of surgical innovation that filtered into domestic use throughout the post-war period. Johnson and Johnson's Zonus porous athletic tape and the standard medical adhesive tape that the company produced in narrower widths for wound dressing were both available in the domestic medicine cabinet by the early 1950s, and their presence reflected the increasing sophistication of home wound management. A clean wound, properly closed with adhesive tape, rather than merely covered with a bandage, healed with considerably less scarring than one allowed to heal, open under a conventional dressing, a fact that the era's domestic medicine practice had absorbed from nursing education materials that filtered into the popular home health literature with some regularity. The woman who used adhesive tape correctly on a kitchen cut was not merely managing a wound. She was applying a surgical principle with domestic materials, and the result was often measurably better than what she would have achieved with the bandage alone. The hair products in the medicine cabinet of 1953 did not describe themselves as such. They lived alongside the aspirin and the cold cream without any apparent sense that they were in a separate category. This is itself telling, that hair maintenance was understood as health maintenance, not as a separate beauty category, and that the chemistry of hair care was considered continuous with the chemistry of the body rather than distinct from it. The bottles and tubes and tins on the hair shelf of the medicine cabinet were unapologetically medicinal in their presentation, and they smelled not of the luxury fragrances of the vanity table, but of something closer to the pharmacy. Sharp, medicinal, functional. Wildroot cream oil was a product whose name perfectly encapsulates its formulation strategy. An emulsion of mineral oil and lanolin in a cream base, marketed primarily to men but used by women as a conditioning treatment for dry, chemically processed hair. It came in a green glass bottle with a slightly viscous pore, and its application to the ends of dry hair before a set was common practice in 1953 households, where permanents were done at home using the home permanent kit, which had itself become one of the defining domestic technologies of the early post-war period. Tony Home Permanent, introduced in 1947, had by the early 1950s generated a domestic permanent wave business of astonishing scale. For $5, which represented approximately a quarter to a third of a professional salon permanent, a woman could process her own hair at home, and many women did this every 6 to 8 weeks. The chemical consequences of this frequency on the hair's protein structure were significant, and wildroot cream oil, rubbed into the ends, represented a rudimentary attempt to manage them. The Tony Home Permanent kit left behind, on the medicine cabinet shelf, a suite of residual products that told the story of the process in chemical terms. The waving lotion, ammonium thioglycolate, which broke the disulfide bonds of the hair's keratin structure, and the neutralizer, which used hydrogen peroxide to reform those bonds in their new curled configuration. Both had a smell that was sharp and unmistakable, a combination of ammonia and sulfur compounds that hung in a closed bathroom for hours after the treatment. Women who home-permed in the 1950s knew this smell the way sailors know salt air, as the reliable signature of a familiar territory. The neutralizer bottle, pale blue and branded with instructions printed in a font of optimistic mid-century confidence, was often kept on the shelf even after the current kit had been used up, because it served as a supplementary treatment for brassiness and a light-duty protein repair that the hair manifestly needed after the alkaline waving lotion. The hair oil was a different category from the cream conditioner, and it occupied its own small bottle on the shelf with its own distinct applications. Brilliantine, originally a French product, widely copied by American manufacturers through the 1940s and 50s, was a light mineral or vegetable oil product that added sheen to processed hair and helped manage the frizz that the combination of permanent wave chemistry and humidity reliably produced. It was applied sparingly, on fingertips, and worked through the ends of dried set hair to smooth the cuticle and add the light reflection that photographs well. The 1950s woman understood that hair required management not at the scalp but at the ends, and that this management was not a luxury but a technical necessity for maintaining the specific visual standards of the era, where hair appeared not wild or natural but deliberately, beautifully organized. The egg shampoo that lived on the shelf is a product category that will surprise readers unfamiliar with the 1950s cleaning technology available for hair. Modern shampoos are surfactant-based, sodium lauryl sulfate or a gentler alkyl sulfate that strips the hair's surface oils and allows them to be rinsed away cleanly. The shampoos of 1953 existed on a spectrum that ranged from soap-based preparations through the new synthetic detergent formulations that companies like Breck and Prell were introducing. The egg in the name of egg shampoo was sometimes literal. Some formulations included hydrolyzed egg protein as a conditioning component, and sometimes aspirational, a marketing term for a product that was understood to be rich and conditioning rather than stripping. Breck Egg Cream Shampoo was one of the better-selling versions, and the Breck girl, pale, luminous-haired, the face of American feminine cleanliness through the 1950s, appeared on its packaging with the calm authority of someone whose hair had always cooperated. The setting lotion that sat near the shampoo on the hair shelf was the foundational chemistry of the post-war hairstyle. Pin curls, roller sets, and the finger wave sections that preceded the finishing brush out all required something to hold them in position as they dried. Lilt wave set, Helene Curtis curl set, and the simpler home preparation of sugar water or beer, genuinely used by women who found these provided satisfactory stiffness with no cost, were applied to sectioned hair before the curlers went in, creating as the hair dried a temporary restructuring of the hydrogen bonds in the hair shaft that held the wave or curl in place until the next washing. This is, in simplified terms, precisely what modern styling products describe as hold, and the underlying chemistry has not changed substantially. What has changed is the fragrance of the delivery system. The scalp tonic occupies the final position on the hair shelf and is perhaps the most pharmaceutically interesting item in the lineup. Wildroot, Kreml, and the various barbershop-derived tonics that were crossing into domestic medicine cabinets through the early 1950s all contained formulations designed to stimulate scalp circulation, control dandruff, itself a significant social anxiety in the decade, aggressively marketed by Head & Shoulders when it launched in 1958, and address the dry scalp conditions that central heating and frequent shampooing both worsened. The tonics typically contained alcohol, which created a brief tingling and cooling sensation, along with various botanical extracts that were credited with stimulating the follicle to greater productivity. Whether they did this with any measurable consistency is uncertain. What is certain is that the act of applying them, the alcohol-cool contact with the scalp, the firm fingertip massage that the instructions prescribed, was itself restorative in ways that did not require chemical justification. The brilliantine and hair oil industry of the 1950s was more diverse and more socially stratified than its humble shelf position in the medicine cabinet might suggest. At the luxury end of the market, brilliantine Eugène, produced by the same Eugène Wave Company, whose name was synonymous with professional permanent wave processing, was a refined mineral oil product in elegant packaging that was recommended for use on processed hair between salon visits. At the practical end, the various petroleum jelly applications that women of the era used on their hair edges and ends reflected a no-nonsense approach to conditioning that was efficient if aesthetically unglamorous. And in between these poles, the bergamot and ambrosia products that African American women were applying to their hair through the 1950s, products designed for the specific management of naturally coily hair textures in a decade whose mainstream beauty products were formulated almost exclusively for straight Euro-American hair, occupied medicine cabinet shelves that the mainstream beauty press almost entirely ignored. The Madame C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, which had been producing hair care products for black American women since the early 1900s, was still operating through the 1950s with a product line that included shampoos, conditioners, and the pressing preparations that were used in conjunction with heated pressing combs to temporarily straighten natural hair textures. The pressing comb itself, a metal comb with close-set teeth that was heated over a flame or electric burner and then drawn through sections of hair to straighten them through heat and tension, was not stored in the medicine cabinet but in the kitchen, where the heat source was available. The oils and pomades that facilitated the pressing process and protected the hair from the direct heat contact lived in the medicine cabinet alongside the setting lotions and the brilliantines, and they tell a story about the 1950s beauty landscape that the mainstream women's magazines, organized almost entirely around the beauty needs of white women, did not tell. The setting lotion chemistry of the period deserves more scientific attention than it typically receives in historical beauty narratives. The temporary wave set that setting lotions produced, the holding of wet hair in a curled position as it dried, creating a wave memory that lasted until the hair was wetted again, operated through a mechanism that the chemistry of polymer solutions describes with some precision. The gum tragacanth, or polyvinyl pyrrolidone, PVP, in commercial setting lotions created polymer chains that adhered to the hair surface as the water evaporated, locking the strand in the position in which it dried. The wave or curl that resulted was not a permanent structural change to the hair's keratin that required the alkaline chemistry of a permanent wave, but a surface-level polymer coating that held the shape until humidity or water broke the polymer network and allowed the hair to return to its natural state. This is functionally exactly what modern styling gels and mousses accomplish. The chemistry has been refined. The principle is unchanged. The dry shampoo preparations that existed in the 1950s are less well known than their current counterparts because they were marketed differently and formulated from different base materials. The most common 1950s dry shampoo was not an aerosol spray but a loose powder, either plain talcum or a proprietary blend of powder and cornstarch with some fragrance added, that was worked into the scalp with the fingertips and then brushed through the hair with a firm bristle brush. The powder absorbed the scalp oils that produced the unwashed appearance, and the vigorous brushing distributed the powder through the length of the hair and then removed most of it, leaving the hair appearing somewhat fresher than before the treatment. It was not a complete substitute for actual shampooing, which was understood without needing to be stated, but it extended the presentable interval between washes in a decade when daily shampooing was neither expected nor particularly advisable for chemically processed hair. The powder compact on the medicine cabinet shelf served double duty in some households. Face powder was applied sparingly to the hairline and part as a dry shampoo for those sections visible in the finished hairstyle, with an improvised pragmatism that characterized the best of 1950s domestic problem-solving. The hairnet that lived in the medicine cabinet, folded in its small envelope, was an item of hair maintenance infrastructure so routinely used in the 1950s that it has become nearly invisible in historical accounts of the era's beauty culture. The human hairnet, woven from real human hair, imported primarily from Europe, very fine and virtually invisible against dark or brown hair, was used to secure the pin-curled or roller-set hair overnight, preserving the set against the mechanical disturbance of sleep. It was applied over the completed set, pinned at the nape with a single bobby pin, and removed in the morning with the rollers or pins before the brushing out ceremony. The alternatives, the satin sleep cap, the scarf wrapped and tied at the crown, served the same function with different aesthetic and practical trade-offs. The hairnet was the most invisible option, which is why it was preferred by women who found the scarf arrangement unwieldy in the night. The professional salon connection to the home medicine cabinet's hair shelf was maintained through a variety of products that crossed the professional domestic boundary, with the pharmacist as intermediary. The Zoto's perm preparations, the Richard Hudnut wave products, and the suave conditioning treatments that began as professional-grade products were reformulated for home use throughout the 1950s as the manufacturers recognized that the domestic permanent wave market was large enough to justify the development investment. The professional salon remained the source of the most sophisticated chemical treatments, bleaching, tinting, the complex double-process permanent that created the platinum blonde look associated with Marilyn Monroe. But the maintenance chemistry between salon visits was conducted at home, with products stored on the medicine cabinet shelf and applied with a practiced competence that made the space between professional appointments as long as the hair's condition would tolerate. The relationship between the salon and the medicine cabinet shelf was symbiotic. The salon created a chemically complex hair situation that required ongoing maintenance, and the medicine cabinet provided the maintenance. There was a category of products in the 1950 medicine cabinet that occupied its designated shelf with a studied invisibility. Present, essential, managed with competence and efficiency, and discussed with a specificity somewhere between never and almost never. The feminine hygiene shelf was the most private territory in the cabinet, and its products were characterized above all else by the quality of their packaging. Plain, discreet, labeled in the neutral language of pharmacology rather than the vivid commercial branding that characterized the cosmetic shelves above. This was intentional. It reflected an understanding between the manufacturers and the women who purchased their products that the transaction was private, that privacy was a form of dignity, and that dignity required packaging designed to disappear. The Kotex company had been producing disposable menstrual pads since 1921, when the Army Nurse Corps' successful wartime use of cellucotton, surgical dressing material, as an improvised menstrual product was recognized by the Kimberly-Clark Company as a commercial opportunity. By the early 1950s, Kotex occupied a dominant position in the American market that it had achieved through a combination of advertising to women through the New Women's magazines, educational outreach through school health programs, and the development of those specific cardboard display boxes and store placement protocols that allowed women to select and pay for the product without speaking to a pharmacist or counter attendant. The self-service dispensing innovation was not trivial. It was genuine accommodation of the social architecture of feminine discretion. The advertisements that Kotex ran throughout the 1950s were an interesting exercise in saying very little about the actual product, while communicating a great deal about the experience it was designed to support. Women in Kotex advertisements swam, danced, played tennis, hosted dinners, and attended theatre performances. They wore white. They looked entirely at ease. The product itself appeared in its packaging in the bottom corner of the advertisement, identified by brand name and nothing else. The absence of explicit product description was not a regulatory limitation, but a cultural choice, one that the Kotex company made deliberately because it understood that its customers did not require or desire explicit instruction in a magazine advertisement. They required the assurance that a particular way of living was available to them during this particular week of their month. The advertisement provided the assurance. The product on the medicine cabinet shelf provided the mechanism. Tampax, which had been incorporated in 1936 and which had spent the 1940s building a market that required it to overcome considerable cultural resistance, had by the early 1950s become a genuine commercial success. Its adoption was fastest among younger women, among urban women, and among women who had been introduced to it through the physical education programs of American high schools and colleges, where its practical advantages for athletic activity were obvious and important. The Tampax box on the medicine cabinet shelf, white cardboard, clinical font, the product described in terms that prioritized function with complete absence of emotional appeal, was by 1953 no longer a signifier of sophistication or novelty, but simply a box of a product that worked, stored in the appropriate place, managed without discussion. The douche preparation is the product on this shelf that requires the most careful historical contextualization, because the medical and commercial status of douching in 1953 was essentially the inverse of its status today. In the post-war decade, vaginal douching was not merely accepted, but actively encouraged by a commercial and, in many cases, a medical culture that had successfully persuaded American women that the vagina's natural self-cleaning function was insufficient, that odor was a real and present social threat, and that the routine use of commercial douche preparations was a mark of hygienic sophistication, rather than, as contemporary gynecology now understands it, a disruption of the vaginal microbiome with the potential to cause precisely the infections the products claim to prevent. Lysol's post-war feminine hygiene campaign is the most notorious example of this commercial category, and it deserves its notoriety. The advertisements, which ran through the 1940s and into the early 1950s in women's magazines, were constructed around the threat of marital estrangement caused by feminine odor. They were not subtle. They showed unhappy husbands, puzzled and distant, while their wives stood in doorways wondering what they had done wrong. The answer was always the same: inadequate feminine hygiene. The product offered as the solution was a diluted Lysol solution used as a douche. The same Lysol that cleaned bathroom tile, diluted to a concentration described on the packaging as safe for the purpose. Whether it was safe in the sense that it did not cause chemical burns was a question that the 1950s medicine cabinet unfortunately could not answer on behalf of the women who used it, because the data did not yet exist in usable form. The answer turned out to be not reliably. Massengill's douche preparations occupied a more cautiously formulated segment of this market, using vinegar and water bases that were closer to physiologically neutral, and which, while still medically unnecessary, were substantially less likely to cause the tissue irritation that concentrated antiseptic preparations produced. The Massengill box on the medicine cabinet shelf was, in this sense, a somewhat safer version of a category that should not have existed as a mass commercial product at all. What the feminine hygiene shelf of the 1950s medicine cabinet ultimately reflects is the particular vulnerability of women as consumers in a commercial culture that was organized around manufactured anxieties about female bodies. The cold cream shelf was selling a ritual that genuinely maintained the skin. The aspirin shelf was selling products that addressed real pain. The feminine hygiene shelf, in significant part, was selling the management of a social shame that the manufacturers themselves had been instrumental in creating. The women who stocked this shelf were not naive. They were responding to genuine commercial and cultural pressure with the resources available to them. The resources were sometimes inadequate. The response was almost always competent. The shelf was managed, as everything in the 1950s medicine cabinet was managed, with efficiency, with discretion, and with the quiet dignity that the decade's particular code of femininity required. The commercial expansion of the feminine hygiene category through the 1950s was driven in large part by the growth of supermarket distribution As the primary retail channel for consumable household products, the introduction of feminine hygiene products into the supermarket, a transition that was largely complete by the mid-1950s, changed the purchase experience in ways that had direct effects on product development and packaging strategy. A product purchased from a pharmacist who might inquire about one's needs and make recommendations was a different kind of transaction from a product selected from a shelf and placed in a shopping cart alongside the Heinz ketchup and the Swift canned ham. The supermarket purchase required packaging that could be identified and selected without assistance, and it required a design language that did not draw attention to itself in a checkout line. The commercial strategy of discretion that the major feminine hygiene brands developed in response to this retail reality produced some of the most carefully anonymized packaging in the history of consumer products. The Kotex box was designed to be recognizable to the purchaser as what it was without communicating its contents to anyone who might observe the purchase from a slight distance. The font was clinical, the color palette neutral, the box dimensions chosen to be indistinguishable at a glance from a box of tissues or a box of stationery. The woman who placed a box of Kotex in her shopping cart in 1955 was engaged in a retail transaction. She had refined to the speed and invisibility of a skilled sleight of hand performance. The tampon applicator design improvements that Tampax introduced through the 1950s reflected the company's understanding that the primary barrier to adoption among unconvinced users was the manual dexterity required for correct insertion without the applicator. Each successive redesign prioritized ease of use and reduced the discomfort that incorrect technique produced, and each redesign was accompanied by educational materials distributed through pharmacies and school health programs that addressed the technique with a directness that the advertising campaigns could not employ in mainstream media. The disconnect between the frank practical instruction of these educational materials and the complete absence of product use information in the magazines where Tampax advertised is one of the more striking communication strategies of the era. The two channels served two different purposes and operated, by mutual commercial understanding, in complete isolation. The douche's commercial decline, which began in the late 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s as gynecological understanding of vaginal microbiome balance improved and was communicated to consumers, is itself instructive about how commercial health anxiety is constructed and deconstructed. The same industry that had built a substantial business on the foundation of manufactured feminine hygiene anxiety had, when the medical evidence became sufficiently clear and liability exposure sufficiently real, a commercial interest in quietly retiring the category. The process was not particularly rapid. The Massengill brand survived through numerous ownership changes into the 21st century before finally being discontinued. The remarkable durability of a commercial category built on a medical fiction is one of the cleaner demonstrations in consumer history that demand, once constructed through advertising, develops a genuine momentum that scientific revision does not easily arrest. The elastic belt that many women in the 1950s used to secure their menstrual pads was a small infrastructure item that lived in the medicine cabinet with the pads themselves, and its design tells a story about the engineering constraints of the era's absorbent technology. The adhesive strip that attaches modern pads to underwear did not exist. The pads of the 1950s were thicker, heavier, and secured to the body through a separate elastic belt worn around the waist, to which the pad's front and back tabs were attached with small fasteners. The belt was adjustable and washable and reusable indefinitely, and its management, the folding and securing of the tabs, the adjustment of the belt tension, the washing and drying between uses, was part of the practical monthly infrastructure of feminine life in the era. The self-adhesive pad, introduced by Johnson & Johnson in the early 1970s, simplified this management substantially and eliminated the belt entirely from domestic practice. Its disappearance from the medicine cabinet was so gradual and so complete that women born after 1970 have no particular category in which to place the object when they encounter it in the belongings of older relatives. The commercial history of Kotex's move into supermarket distribution illuminates a broader story about the post-war transformation of the retail pharmacy into something closer to a convenience goods store. The independent pharmacy of the 1940s, where the pharmacist knew his customers by name and the purchasing of personal hygiene products was a semi-private transaction, was being supplemented and in some neighbourhoods replaced by the chain drugstore and the supermarket health and beauty aisle throughout the 1950s, and this retail transition had significant effects on both the products that became available and the manner in which women encountered and selected them. The self-service display, the anonymous shelf, the shopping cart that held the feminine hygiene products, alongside the canned soup and the laundry detergent. These were not neutral retail technologies. They were social architectures that changed the experience of women's health and hygiene consumption in ways that were broadly welcomed by the women themselves, for whom the anonymous efficiency of the supermarket purchase was considerably preferable to the semi-public transaction of the counter purchase. The menstrual pain management that the medicine cabinet's aspirin and heating preparation supported was, in the 1950s, a matter almost entirely of personal and domestic management rather than medical engagement. The concept that severe menstrual cramping, primary dysmenorrhea, in the clinical terminology that was not in wide circulation in the popular press of the era, might have a physiological rather than a psychological basis was not absent from the medical literature, but was not the dominant clinical framing. The woman who spent the first day of her period managing severe pain with aspirin, hot water bottles, and the strategic management of her domestic schedule was doing so largely alone, in the particular privacy that feminine biological function occupied in the decade's social code. The prostaglandin inhibitors that would eventually provide genuinely effective pharmacological management of dysmenorrhea were not available in any form until ibuprofen's introduction in the 1970s and its over-the-counter availability in the 1980s. The aspirin and the rubber hot water bottle on the medicine cabinet shelf were the best available tools. The women who used them did not complain loudly about their inadequacy. The nail shelf of the 1950s medicine cabinet was the most visually dramatic section of an otherwise predominantly neutral-coloured pharmaceutical landscape. The nail polish bottles, squat, rounded at the base with a tall cylindrical cap, almost always in shades of red or coral or pink, were the only items in the medicine cabinet that were unambiguously decorative in their aesthetic identity. Everything else on the shelves was brown glass or white metal or cardboard. The nail polish bottle was a small jewel, and in 1954, having a small jewel on your medicine cabinet shelf was not vanity, it was maintenance. The American nail care industry in the 1950s was organized primarily around two companies whose commercial rivalry produced some of the most culturally significant advertising of the era. Revlon, under the ferociously competitive direction of Charles Revson, had by 1950 transformed the nail polish category from a practical grooming product into an expression of feminine self-determination so potent that it made the company's first television advertising campaign on the $64,000 question in 1955 one of the decade's great commercial spectacles. And Q-Tex, produced by Northam Warren, which had been the dominant name in nail polish since the 1920s, and which had built its position on the practical claim of superior chip resistance and a longer wearing finish. Between these two, the medicine cabinet shelf was well supplied with both the ambition of colour and the practical reality of maintenance. The nail polish bottle itself was a technical object whose design had been refined through the 1940s to address specific problems of the product's practical use. The brush inside the cap needed to be calibrated to pick up the right amount of polish without flooding the nail or requiring multiple dips. The formula needed to be fluid enough to apply smoothly, but viscous enough not to run into the cuticle. The solvent evaporation rate needed to be slow enough to allow application and fast enough to allow stacking of the subsequent coat within a practical time window. Revlon's chemists spent considerable effort on these questions, and the superiority of the Revlon brush and formulation was something that women who worked with both brands regularly could assess by direct experience. The names that Revlon applied to its colours were a separate commercial genius. Fire and Ice, launched in 1952 with one of the most sophisticated print advertising campaigns in cosmetic history. A full-page spread in Vogue that asked women a series of revealing questions about their desires and their daring, before announcing that Fire and Ice was their colour, was not merely a nail polish. It was a statement. Persian melon, cherry coral, bachelor's carnation. These were names that operated simultaneously as descriptions, as aspirations, and as small narrative fictions about the kind of woman who would choose them. The naming of nail colours was marketing at its most concentrated, 3 words or fewer, carrying a full emotional address. The polish remover that lived beside the polish bottles was a product of considerably less glamour, but no less importance. Acetone-based removers in the 1950s were more aggressive than the refined formulations of subsequent decades. They stripped the oil from the nail plate along with the polish, leaving the nails somewhat dry and brittle if used very frequently. The application technique was specific. A cotton ball soaked not saturated with remover, pressed firmly against the nail for a count of 3 to allow the acetone to dissolve the lacquer, then wiped in a single downward stroke toward the tip. Multiple wiping motions spread the dissolved polish onto the surrounding skin, creating the characteristic orange-tinted ring at the cuticle line that indicated insufficient technique. The 1950s nail care ritual was, in this sense, a practical skill that required learning. The nail buffer, a small rectangular block covered on its faces with varying grades of chamois leather, lived on the nail shelf as well, though its use was somewhat more occasional than the polish and remover. Buffing was the technique used between polishing cycles, and on occasions when painted nails were not appropriate. Certain conservative professional settings, certain religious observations, certain social environments where conspicuous nail colour would have been read as inappropriate. The buffer produced a natural high-gloss shine on the natural nail that was understood as the respectable alternative to polish, rather than merely its absence. A buffed nail was not an unpolished nail. It was a specifically maintained nail, and the distinction was recognised by women who understood the grammar of 1950s grooming. The orange stick, a small wooden tool with one pointed end and one flattened end, used for pushing back the cuticle after it had been softened with oil or cream, completed the nail shelf toolkit. Cuticle management in the 1950s was not optional. A raised or ragged cuticle was visible evidence of neglect and the standard of visible nail care. The even half moon at the base of each nail, the smooth cuticle line, the uniform polish application, was a standard that required weekly attention and the correct tools. The orange stick, at a cost of perhaps 10 cents for a package of 12, was the least expensive item in the medicine cabinet, and perhaps the most regularly used. What the nail shelf of the 1950s medicine cabinet tells us most clearly is that the hand in the post-war decade was a visible document. Women who worked outside the home, and substantially more women did in the 1950s than the dominant cultural mythology acknowledges, were observed, assessed, and in some professional contexts evaluated on the presentation of their hands. A woman in a sales or receptionist or secretarial role, whose nails were unpolished or whose polish was chipped, was sending a message she did not intend to send. The nail shelf existed to prevent that message. 3 to 4 hours of dedicated attention each week, distributed across the application, maintenance and removal cycle of a good lacquer, was the investment required to maintain the standard. The Revlon fire and ice bottle on the medicine cabinet shelf was not there for frivolity. It was there because the standard required it. The history of nail colour in the 1950s is also the history of American women's relationship to conspicuous self-decoration in the post-war public sphere. And this relationship was more complicated than the cheerful Revlon advertisements suggested. The red nail was simultaneously an assertion of femininity, an expression of leisure. Only women who did not perform physical labour could maintain red nails without chipping, a marker of sophistication, and, in certain professional contexts, a signal that needed careful management. The school teacher of 1953 wore shorter nails and more conservative nail colours than the receptionist. The nurse kept her nails very short and entirely unpolished because hospital hygiene protocols, which were considerably more stringent about nail appearance than about hand-washing frequency, in a somewhat inverted set of priorities, required it. The woman who worked in an office generally wore polish, because polish was part of the standard of professional feminine grooming, but she selected colours toward the coral and rose end of the spectrum for daytime rather than the deeper reds that were understood as evening. The gel manicure, the acrylic overlay, the nail art movement, all of this was decades in the future. The 1950s nail was the natural nail, maintained, shaped, polished, and tended with the consistency that the materials required, and the natural nail of a woman who had maintained it properly from adolescence, who had taken her daily gelatin capsule, the standard recommendation of the beauty columns, based on the theory that gelatin improved nail hardness, a theory that subsequent research has not particularly supported but which was widely believed, who had worn gloves for dishwashing and garden work, and who'd applied her cuticle oil diligently on Tuesday and Friday evenings. This nail was a remarkable thing. Long, naturally strong, with a consistent arc and a smooth surface that took polish well and held it. The medicine cabinet shelves that served this natural nail were not stocked with construction materials, but with maintenance products. And the distinction is one that the natural nail advocates of the 21st century have somewhat laboriously rediscovered. The nail hardener that appeared in the early 1950s medicine cabinet was a relatively new product category, attempting to address the problem of nail brittleness that resulted from frequent polish and acetone removal. Barriel had introduced one of the early commercial formulations, containing formaldehyde as its active hardening agent, which genuinely worked by cross-linking the nail plate's keratin chains, but which in the concentrations that demonstrated efficacy also caused the brittleness and separation it was intended to prevent if used with excessive frequency. The formaldehyde nail hardeners of the 1950s were the first instance of a pattern that would recur throughout the beauty industry's 20th century history, a product that worked at a cost that its early adopters discovered gradually, whose reformulation towards safer but slightly less effective alternatives would come in the following decade. The nail brush, a small stiff-bristled brush designed specifically for cleaning beneath the nail edge, lived in the medicine cabinet as a hygiene tool rather than a beauty tool, but its presence reflected the same standard of presented cleanliness that governed the rest of the nail shelf's contents. Clean nails in the 1950s were not merely the absence of visible dirt, they were the presence of scrubbed cleanliness, visibly maintained with a brush used specifically for the purpose. The woman who served dinner, poured coffee, reached across a table, all the hand-visible acts of social hospitality, was understood to be presenting her hands in this environment, and the nails were part of that presentation in the same way that her gloves were part of a street appearance. The nail brush was used at the end of food preparation, at the end of garden maintenance, at the end of any activity that might have introduced material beneath the nail. This was not fastidiousness, it was standard. The quick-dry drops that some women added to their nail finishing routine in the early 1950s were a development from the professional salon environment that found their way into the domestic medicine cabinet through the mail-order beauty catalogues and the pharmacy shelves of the late 40s and early 50s. Applied over freshly painted nails, the drops, which contained solvents that accelerated surface evaporation without disturbing the underlying polish layers, reduced the drying time from the standard 20 minutes of patient immobility to something closer to 10, which was a meaningful domestic time saving for a woman with other things to do. Whether they worked as reliably as advertised depended heavily on the specific formulation and the ambient humidity, and the beauty columns of the era devoted considerable space to reader complaints about smudged nails achieved through insufficiently proven drying shortcuts. The patience required by the 1950s nail ritual was not accidental. The materials made it necessary, and the era's relationship with patience was, in any case, more comfortable than our own. The nail care tools that supplemented the polish and remover on the medicine cabinet shelf were modest in number, but specific in their purposes. The emery board, sandpaper wrapped around a thin cardboard strip in standard and fine grit, was used to shape and smooth the nail edge after clipping with the small nail scissors that lived in the manicure kit stored in the cabinet drawer. The clipping then filing sequence was considered the correct technique, with the scissors used for the bulk reduction and the emery board for the final shaping and smoothing of the free edge. The metal nail file, a flat implement with a rough surface that some women preferred for its more aggressive shaping capacity, was a second tool that some cabinets included alongside the emery board. The distinction between a filed nail and a cut and filed nail was visible to the practiced eye, and the 1950s beauty columns were the practiced eye, noting in their practical instruction columns that scissors and file produced a cleaner edge with less splitting tendency than nail clippers, which had a tendency to compress the nail plate slightly at the moment of cut and create microfractures that propagated into splits over subsequent days. There was always a back row, in every medicine cabinet of the 1950s, behind the aspirin and the cold cream, behind the nail polish remover and the setting lotion, behind the items of current and active use. There was a back row that was harder to reach and seldom fully catalogued even by the woman whose cabinet it was. This back row is the most interesting section of the entire medicine cabinet, because it contained the items that had not been discarded but were no longer in regular rotation, and the reasons for their retention tell you something precise and honest about the way women in the post-war decade understood their own lives, their bodies, and the gap between what they presented and what they privately managed. The vitamin bottles lived in the back row. Multiple, overlapping, Schiff's vitamin B complex, McKesson's vitamin C tablets in a large orange glass jar, the squib cod liver oil capsules that were technically for children, but which found adult adherence in households where fish was not a regular dietary staple. The vitamin supplement industry in the 1950s was in the early stages of the expansion that would make it a permanent feature of American consumer health culture, and its products occupied the back row of the medicine cabinet in somewhat chaotic profusion, bought with specific intent, used inconsistently, retained past their print date with the slightly guilty optimism that they might still be effective. The vitamin bottle that had been opened in January and was still 90% full in November told a truthful story about the distance between health aspiration and health behavior, and every medicine cabinet contained at least one. The Benzedrine inhaler is the back row item that most directly illustrates the pharmaceutical innocence of the era. Smith, Klein, and French had introduced the Benzedrine inhaler in 1949 as an over-the-counter nasal decongestant, and it was available at every pharmacy in America without prescription throughout the early 1950s. It contained amphetamine base in a cotton plug inside a small cylindrical inhaler, and its declared purpose was the relief of nasal congestion. Its actual use among American housewives in the 1950s was considerably more interesting. Amphetamine's stimulant effects, increased alertness, reduced appetite, elevated mood, were well known by word of mouth if not by explicit marketing, and the Benzedrine inhaler's availability without prescription made it an over-the-counter stimulant of unusual potency. The Food and Drug Administration removed it from the over-the-counter market in 1959 when the extent of its non-decongestant use had become sufficiently visible to require regulatory response. The barbiturate sleeping preparations that lived near the Benzedrine inhaler in some back rows of the 1950s medicine cabinet were the pharmacological complement to the stimulant, the down to the inhaler's up. Nembutal and Seconal, both barbiturates, were available by prescription throughout the decade, and their prescription rate to American women was substantially higher than to American men, tracking a pattern that would continue through the 1960s and the broader prescription sedative culture that Betty Friedan would describe in The Feminine Mystique in 1963. The woman who had a small amber bottle of sleeping pills in the back row of her medicine cabinet in 1955 was not statistically an unusual woman. She was simply a woman for whom the management of the daily demands of her domestic role had extended into the management of her sleep with pharmaceutical assistance. Her doctor had prescribed it. She had filled it. She used it carefully. She did not discuss it. The birth control products of the 1950s occupied the back row with particular need for discretion, given that the legal and social status of contraception in the post-war decade was substantially more complicated than the subsequent revolution of oral contraception would rearrange. The pill would not receive FDA approval for contraceptive use until 1960. In the 1950s, contraception for married women was legal in most but not all American states, but it remained deeply socially coded, a private matter of marriage management, discussed with the physician in the specific context of family planning, and stored in the medicine cabinet without identification. The diaphragm in its round case, the spermicidal jelly in its tube, these were clinical items, managed as such, stored as such, absent from the vocabulary of polite social conversation. The prescription bottles that populated the very back of the medicine cabinet back row represent the final and most private category of the 1950s domestic pharmaceutical landscape. Not the current prescription, that lived in an accessible position on the middle shelf, but the completed or discontinued one, kept with an uncertain rationale that combined the frugal impulse to retain something of potential value with the domestic habit of not discarding things until their worthlessness was beyond question. The antibiotic course completed in March of last year. The codeine tablets prescribed after a dental procedure, 10 still remaining, potentially useful in some future circumstance not yet arisen. The thyroid medication that had been adjusted and superseded. These bottles accumulated in the back row as a pharmaceutical autobiography of the previous several years, and together they told the story of a life's ordinary medical texture with a specificity that no other domestic document quite matched. What the back row of the medicine cabinet ultimately reveals, taken in total, is that the 1950s woman was managing a considerably more complex internal landscape than the external presentation of cheerful, domestic competence suggested. The bright kitchen, the pressed house dress, the polished nails and the set hair, and the Revlon red lips were a genuine expression of aesthetic standards that she maintained with real skill and daily effort. They were also, sometimes, a performance that required pharmaceutical infrastructure to sustain. The Benzedrine that got through Tuesday, the barbiturate that manufactured Wednesday night's sleep, the vitamin supplement that promised to address the fatigue that neither the stimulant nor the sedative fully resolved. These were not signs of failure. They were evidence of a particular kind of systematic stress, invisibly born, professionally managed, and stored with characteristic tidiness in the back row of a white metal cabinet behind the aspirin and the cold cream. The medicine cabinet is, in the end, the most honest room in the house. It contains the gap between the person presented to the world and the person who faces the mirror each morning before the construction begins. In 1953, that gap was managed with remarkable competence and a very specific kind of courage. The courage not of dramatic action, but of quiet, daily, relentless maintenance. The woman who opened her medicine cabinet each morning and assembled from its shelves the instruments of her presented self was engaged in an act of will as deliberate and disciplined as anything the decade produced. The cabinet held her tools. She knew how to use them. And she began again each morning with the cold cream jar and the powder puff, and the particular, irreplaceable dignity of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. The children's section of the 1950s medicine cabinet, which existed in every household with children as a distinct subset of the adult shelf, identifiable by its smaller bottle sizes and more cheerfully coloured packaging, tells a parallel story to the adult contents that is worth at least a brief examination. Children's aspirin in the 1950s was a flavoured chewable tablet in an orange or cherry formulation that Bayer and St. Joseph's both produced, and it was administered for childhood fever and pain, with a confidence that the Ray's syndrome research of the 1970s would substantially complicate. The children's medicine shelf also held the St. Joseph's children's aspirin, the chewable vitamins in the Flintstones format that would arrive from Miles Laboratories in 1968, and before then the more earnest vitamin formulations in liquid or chewable forms from Squibb and various house brands. The care taken in managing the children's section of the cabinet was itself a form of domestic performance. The well-stocked children's medicine shelf was evidence of responsible parenthood in a decade where parental adequacy was measured with some public rigour. The prescription section of the 1950s medicine cabinet requires its own acknowledgement as a zone of medical dependency that post-war pharmaceutical expansion had considerably enlarged. The sulfur drugs of the 1940s had been the first wave of prescription antibiotic technology to reach the domestic medicine cabinet, and by the early 1950s they had been succeeded by penicillin and its expanding family of derivatives, which were prescribed with the generosity that reflected the era's genuine wonder at having bacterial infection under anything approaching pharmaceutical control. The medicine cabinet of 1953 typically held a completed course of penicillin with a few tablets remaining. the precise amount that the patient had discontinued taking when symptoms resolved, before the course was complete, producing in that small amber bottle the first generation of penicillin-resistant bacterial strains in the American domestic environment. The public health consequences of this prescription pattern, generous antibiotic dispensing combined with patient non-completion of courses, would take several decades to fully materialize. The hormone preparations that some 1950s medicine cabinets contained represent a pharmaceutical frontier that the era approached with a confidence that subsequent decades significantly revised. Premarin, conjugated equinestrogens derived from the urine of pregnant mares and approved by the FDA in 1942, was prescribed through the 1950s for menopausal symptom management with a broad hand that reflected the era's genuinely optimistic reading of hormone replacement as a way of managing the biological experience of aging femininity. The medicine cabinet of a woman in her late 40s or 50s in 1955 might contain a Premarin prescription alongside her aspirin and her cold cream, and she would manage this pharmaceutical addition to her routine with the same efficient pragmatism with which she managed everything else on the shelf. The Women's Health Initiative research that would significantly reframe the risk-benefit calculation of hormone replacement was still decades away. The travel medicine kit that lived in the medicine cabinet, or in a small zippered case tucked into the bottom drawer below it, ready to be transferred to a travel bag, was a miniaturized version of the full cabinet's contents, and its composition was itself instructive about what the 1950s woman considered non-negotiable even in abbreviated domestic infrastructure. The travel kit contained aspirin, band-aids, iodine, cold cream in a small pot, tooth powder or a travel-sized toothpaste, Listerine in a pocket-sized bottle, and a small amount of whatever regular prescription medication was in rotation. It was practical, compact, and organized around the assumption that a woman traveling away from her home medicine cabinet would need to maintain the same standards of health management and personal presentation that she maintained at home. Travel was not an occasion for the relaxation of standards. It was an occasion for their efficient miniaturization. The medicine cabinet itself, the white metal box with the mirror door and the adjustable glass shelves, typically mounted at eye level above the bathroom sink, was an architectural innovation of the early 20th century that by the 1950s had become so standard a feature of the American bathroom that its absence would have been remarkable. It was cleaned regularly, though not with the frequency of the bathroom surfaces below it. The mirror wiped with newspaper and water. The shelves swabbed with rubbing alcohol. The contents checked for expiration dates with a seasonal thoroughness that varied by household. The woman who opened the medicine cabinet each morning to begin her routine was engaging with the most private inventory in her house, a record of her health, her beauty practice, her private anxieties and their pharmaceutical management, her standards of cleanliness and presentation, and the specific social pressures that the decade brought to bear on her body and her appearance. The medicine cabinet was not merely a storage space. It was a biography, organized on glass shelves behind a mirror, updated constantly and consulted daily. To read its contents carefully is to understand, with considerable precision, what it cost to be a woman in 1953, and what tools she reached for each morning to meet that cost with competence and grace. The medicine cabinet's mirror was itself a significant object in the psychology of 1950s feminine daily life, and it deserves a final moment of attention before the cabinet door is closed. The mirror on the cabinet door was a small mirror, typically 6 by 14 inches in a standard single-door cabinet, and it was used not for full-body assessment but for the close-up work of face construction, brow drawing, mascara application and lipstick placement, the woman who stood before this mirror each morning was conducting a specific and intimate self-assessment, checking the quality of last night's cream cleaning work, evaluating the skin's response to the previous week's cosmetic use, noting the dryness of the cheek or the breakout at the chin that would require a specific response from the shelf. The mirror was an instrument of self-knowledge as much as self-decoration. It was honest in a way that larger mirrors, encountered at greater distances, are not. And the woman who faced it each morning, who opened the cabinet behind it to select her tools and execute her routine, was engaging with herself with a directness and a competence that the cheerful surfaces of the era's domestic imagery never quite captured. The cold cream at the centre of the shelf, the aspirin 2 rows down, the fire and ice on the nail shelf, the smelling salts in the back, all of it waiting, as it waited every morning for the door to open and the day to begin.